We continue with our podcast today of the Prophetic Writing series, dealing with the book The Beginnings. And today we're dealing with the relocation of the Israelites, the settlers at Avaris, from Avaris to Mount Horeb in Arabia. So we see that in the Babylonian captivity, the priests are rewriting their documents, and they want to show this miraculous relocation from Egypt, and then the miraculous, the Lord keeping them miraculously for 40 years and then taking them miraculously into the purported promised land. They wanted to show God working every day with them to back up their statement that God had given them an everlasting covenant for this land, and that he would personally drive these people out of the land and annihilate them and kill them. And we show that that wasn't actually the case. And we've shown that what actually happened, the background to the story was that often, many times when there was drought and terrible conditions, many of the Canaanites traveled to the fertile valleys of Egypt and settled there. And we show that this is actually what happened. We showed that the Hyksos, the foreign kings, ruled in northern Egypt for about 300 years, from around 1782 to 1570 BC, and that they got a foothold there, and they defeated the Egyptians, and the Egyptians moved their capital further south to the southern parts of Egypt, and they ruled from there. And then over the years they strengthened themselves, and they started to oust these peoples, to remove them from the land. They saw them as a political instability because they ruled various areas, and they started to exile them. And then later they couldn't come against they couldn't defeat the Amorites at Avaris, and that's the region where the Israelites were. We've shown that Abraham was an Amorite, and that's why he mixed with Amoritic peoples, and that's why they settled at Avaris, because that is where the Hyksos were. And they couldn't oust them, and eventually these people were actually paid compensation to leave. We found this stele of Ahmose, the Egyptian military commander, and he writes of giving gifts to people, gold, silver, and certain materials and cloth, the valuable stuff. And indications are that they paid those peoples to actually relocate from that area. And he speaks of a flood that happened in the Nile River, and the stele is a little bit damaged, but one can read between the lines that actually these people left that area. And eventually he says on the stele that the king can now rest in his palace in peace because these people left the area. They also blamed the effects of various plagues and that on these peoples, and one of them was the Black Plague that was in that area. But these plagues were killing all and sundry. They would have killed people at Avaris, they would have killed the Amorites, etc. But they felt that these people were a bad influence in the country. And also there was the volcanic eruption, the Thera eruption at Santorini, and that was an amazing explosion that occurred there, and it would have darkened the sky for a lengthy period, and the ash would have been everywhere, and it would have caused tsunamis to come through the Mediterranean, and those would have even gone up some of the tributaries of the Nile. So all of these type of things they blamed on those people at Avaris. It was a trading port along the tributary of the Nile, and apparently their ships brought the plague, and the rats from the boats went ashore, and the Black Plague started. And that was common knowledge between people at that time. Even Josephus speaks of it, and Manetho, the Egyptian writer, wrote various things, and Apion, and in his writings against these people, we see that Josephus deals with this. But he doesn't dispute the fact that they actually left the area, or that they were paid to leave the area. He doesn't dispute that, and we cover all of that in the book. And it was common knowledge that they left that area and eventually settled in Jerusalem, and that would have been written of around about 1000 BC when David established the settlement at Jerusalem. So we mention all of that in the book, and we state that they actually left there, and there weren't these amazing miracles that happened. They left unimpeded, and they went and they settled at Horeb. Now, Horeb is in Saudi Arabia, and we mentioned this confusion that they tried to establish with Mount Sinai. We state that there wasn't ever a Mount Sinai, and that the word Sinai actually means the moon god's sin. And the reason they were trying to establish a Sinai situation was there was that passage in Judges which spoke about the Lord descending, Jehovah descending on Mount Seir, and the mountain shook and Sinai shook, but Sinai wasn't the mountain. Sinai was the moon god's sin, and we show that the people at Edom previously worshipped the moon god's sin, and they state that they chose new gods. So that's when Jehovah moved from was pictured moving from Mount Seir to Canaan. And he brought the rains that helped the Israelites defeat Sisera and his armies during the time of Deborah. And Barak was then defeated them. And because of that, they largely turned as a nation to serve Jehovah. And previously, they had served El-Elyon, which was a Canaanitish god that was passed on to them by Melchizedek. We show that there were elements of the true God within these religious cosmologies, in the El-Elyon cosmology, but none of these cosmologies pictured God perfectly in terms of his character. It's only through Messiah that we have the true character of God, and that's why the Hebrew writers in chapter 1 state that in past times they were spoken to by the patriarchs and by the prophets, but in this time they've been spoken to by the Son, who's the exact representation of the nature of God. So we see Messiah was Emmanuel, God with us. He was the reflection of God to the people at that time. And we only know the true character of God from that time. So we see that all of these plagues and Exodus and things, there was never a great plague brought about by God in that time. There was the fallout from the Thera volcanic eruption, and there was the Black Plague that attacked them. And what happened was that during the time, the early years, the Israelites put out and they projected the idea that their gods brought on these things. And we show this in the book of Samuel, and we show that it's actually mentioned there, but none of these actual plagues. That was 1 Samuel 4:8. They speak about the Philistines speak about these Israelites bringing the plagues on them. But that was a myth that developed. And none of the specific plagues are actually mentioned. And we see that they actually left that area unimpeded for Mount Horeb. There was never a Mount Sinai named after the moon god Sin. So the Egyptians believed that the Shemmo, they called the foreigners Shemmo, were the cause of the Black Plague and the various sicknesses that befell Egypt, and was the reason they wanted to expel the Shemmo, who were also a political threat to the Egyptians. And these sicknesses and diseases affected all the people in the region, not only the Egyptians. And I give various commentary there, S. Mason that writes about Flavius Josephus, the translation and the commentary and various things that he states. And this was common knowledge. In Amos 9 it speaks of this, and it stated there, pardon me, "Are you not as the sons of Ethiopia to me, O sons of Israel, declares the Lord? Have I not brought up Israel from the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Arameans from Kir?" And it speaks of all these peoples that were previously, some of them like the Philistines and the Israelites or the Amorites were brought out of Egypt. And that was common knowledge to them at that time. So we see the Israelites relocate from Egypt, and we see that there weren't any miraculous parting of the Red Sea and all these different things. The scribes were writing that to try and depict the day-by-day protection of God, to show that they were bringing them to this promised land that we show was never actually promised to them. And that God said they would be his people amongst the people, as shown in Exodus 19, verse 5 and 6. And we've shown that in the book. So they moved into Media, where the Israelites set up a transit camp for themselves in the land of the Midianites. And the texts show that the Israelites stayed near Horeb for a considerable amount of time. All probability, they could have been there for decades, and they lived there up to 40 years. Now, the travel route is mentioned in Exodus 14, and we show continually in our book that some of the items are bona fide items that appear in there. And part of this was the Exodus route. Now, I'll mention this in Exodus 14 from verse 1. Now, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Tell the sons of Israel to turn back the camp before Pi-Hirioth, between Migdol and the sea, and you shall camp in front of Baal-Zephon, opposite it by the sea. For Pharaoh will say to the sons of Israel, they are wandering aimlessly in the land, and wilderness has shut them in." Now, these terms here all speak of that journey from Avaris to Mount Horeb. And we've used this Exodus travel route by Steve Rudd. It's shown on the internet, and the basic description how to get there was fairly easy. It's moved southward along the coast of the eastern side of the Red Sea to the Straits of Tiran, a distance of some 300 kilometers. On the way, you will pass the copper and turquoise mines at Serabit al-Kadim, and that's mentioned as Sukkoth in their particular writings, where you should be in a position to be refreshed. And when you get to the straits, where the head of the waters in the mouth flow, that's Ha-Hiroth, meaning a mouth of water, you'll see near the coast the high ground or tower, Migdol, meaning watchtower, where they'll watch out for incoming boats into the straits of Tiran. And be careful not to pass the straits, otherwise you'll be shut in, Etham, meaning shut in, by the mountains, and take the ferry to the islands in the mouth of the Gulf, where they've built the Baal worship site, Baal-Zephon, in the Straits of Tiran, on the island of Tiran, and then move on to the mainland, and at the mainland take the road to Horeb, where Moses is resident. And if you get lost, ask for Jethro, Moses' father-in-law. He's well known. So they used this type of movement, and they moved over to Horeb, and they would have stayed there for 30, 40 years. Now, they wanted to show God working with them every day. They didn't want to show God just leaving them to languish there, which is actually what happened. And the story of the moving around the mountain was them seeking grazing and their sheep and everything, and they kept moving around this mountain. And they tried to show show their captors in Babylon that God acted miraculously on their behalf, and that God was leading them every step of the way. But we show this didn't happen. God was working with them and working with their leaders. God worked with Moses, and Moses used to go up the mountain of the Lord, which we show was in Saudi Arabia, and he meditated and God ministered to him. But they were trying to show a miraculous journey and a miraculous presence, and they wanted to back up the story that God promised them the land of Canaan, and then added all these fabrications into the story. In the book we give more information, and we show clearly what happened, and we show the references to other writings and other research that was made, and we show that there weren't these miraculous things that took place to actually get them out of the land. We show that they negotiated a departure. The Amorites negotiated this departure with the Egyptians, and they were paid out compensation for their homes, for their businesses, and they left there unimpeded, and there was no parting of the Red Sea and various things that took place. These books are available on Amazon.com and bookbaby.com. You can do a search under Ernest Austin Adams. Thank you for watching.